All right, hopefully you had some success with this problem. In this section, we're going to walk through the solution. Now, for this particular problem, we're only going to go through one solution. There are certainly multiple solutions to this when you consider the fact that actually reversing the set of numbers here can be done many different ways. However, we already spoke about some of the different ways to reverse strings in one of the last problems we worked on. So this time around, we're just going to kind of beeline a very direct way of reversing the actual number. And we'll focus a lot more on how we kind of work with the number in general and how we maintain that negative sign on there. So let's give this a shot. Inside of my function body, the first thing that I really want to do is give myself the ability to reverse the number. That's what I really care about here. I want to reverse the number. So in order to reverse the number, we're going to use the same methodology that we used in that previous section. We're going to take the number, we're going to somehow treat it as a string. We'll split that number into an array, we'll use the reverse method on it, and then we'll join it back together. So let's at least do that much and see what happens. So I'm going to take n, that's the number that gets provided to us, and I want to first turn this number into a string. So I'm going to call n.toString. So now we're working with a string as opposed to a number. And at this point, we can now use all that split, reverse, and join methodology that we saw in the previous problem. So I can call split to turn this into an array. I can reverse it because it is an array, and then I can join it back together into a string, like so. Now, at this point, let's just kind of make sure we get our return statement in here, and then I want to run our tests and see how far this gets us. I want to see what this is really going to do for us. So back at my command line, I can run my tests again by pressing the Enter key, and it looks like, interesting. So here's one of the tests right here. Rather than producing the expected -5, our code is currently producing 5 minus as a string. Notice the set of quotes right there. So it looks like we've got two big issues. On the one hand, we're not properly dealing with the negative sign, and on the other hand, we're still returning a string here, as opposed to the number that we are expected to return. So let's take a look at this and see what we can do. Well, in order to make sure that we return a number out of this thing, we can use the parseInt function. So rather than immediately returning the result of this reversal, I'm going to assign this to a variable that I'll call reversed. And then right underneath, let's return parseInt of reversed, like so. So now we're trying to actually pull an integer out of the string that we just produced. I'll save this and let's see what happens now. So now if we look at our tests again, it looks like we're passing more tests than we were before, but we still have this one test down here failing, specifically around handling a negative number. So at this point, we are expected to return -5 on this, but our code has produced 5. So it appears that even though we were able to somehow pull an integer out of that reversal, we did not actually maintain the sign. So we're not including the negative sign. We somehow lost the negative sign during the parseInt process. So now all we really have to do is figure out whether or not we should get this number to be negative or positive. Deciding that really comes down to that input number of n. So if n is greater than 0, then we want to just leave everything as is. If n is less than 0, then we want to multiply the result of this by -1 to turn it into a negative number. So let's try writing out that logic. We can say if n is less than 0, then return parseInt of reversed, and we will multiply this by -1, like so. So if n is less than 0, return early, multiply it by -1, otherwise just parse the number out and we're done. So let's try this. I'll save the file. And now it looks like our tests are passing. Cool. So this is definitely a working solution right here, but clearly having these two return statements that both call parseInt isn't super ideal. So if you stuck around at the end of the last section when I spoke about some of the little tricks that you can use to really solve this problem in a very direct fashion, the last trick that I suggested was a function that is a part of the JavaScript standard library called math.sign. So if we pass math.sign a positive number, it will return 1. If we pass math.sign a negative number, it will return -1. So rather than putting this complicated if statement in here, we can just dump the entire thing and instead multiply the result of our parseInt function right here times math.sign, and we'll pass an n. So now math.sign is really taking the place of the if statement that we just had. If n is greater than 0, it'll be positive, or the result of all this will be positive. Otherwise, if n is less than 0, then the result of all of this will be a -1, and we'll end up with a negative number. So let's save this and see how we're doing. Cool. So now we're still back to 4 passing tests, but our code here is looking pretty straightforward. Now, one thing I want to throw out there, it's totally up to you. This is really a style thing, but you'll notice that we didn't really have to come up with this temporary variable reversed right here. We could have easily wrapped this entire statement inside of the parseInt function call. However, I think that the code right here looks pretty legible in this fashion, and really if we wanted to kind of put everything into a one-liner, it really ends up being kind of nasty. And I've actually got a example of that I'll copy paste onto the screen. So this would be kind of the one-line solution right here. I think that it's really tough to understand what's going on. So personally, I would really recommend leaving it as the 2 separate statements, like so. Great, so like I said, this is just one solution. There was many ways that we could kind of reiterate on this thing and change up the actual reversal of the number, but we already spoke about some of the different ways of reversing a string. If you came up with a different solution for actually handling the negative sign here, or actually pulling a number out of the string, that's totally fine, but this is definitely a solution that works as well. So let's take a break here. We'll continue in the next section and move on to our next problem.